Ah yes, Splatoon. This was a summer game of mine that I ultimately enjoyed very much despite it being a third-person shooter game, and while these types of games wouldn't usually interest me, the way the game looks and plays interested me so much to a point where I actually asked for it when walking through a Target one day, and ever since then, I've been a pretty big fan of the series. I've had a blast playing through the original Splatoon on the Wii U, ranging from trying out new weapons and maps to experiencing Splatfest and its colorful, vibrant nature with its host Callie Marie. Splatoon is a gaming experience that I will never forget back in 2015. But years later, I revisited the world of Inkopolis Plaza with the release of my Battle Dojo video that you can see right now. And needless to say, my perception for Splatoon 1, despite all of its nostalgia, did kinda simmer down a bit, especially with the much more flexible controls of both Splatoon 2 and 3. But if there's one thing that always holds true from Splatoon 1's perspective, it would be the map design. The stages in Splatoon seems to have garnered a bit of a different reputation depending on the game, with the most current iteration being generally received in a negative light due to its layouts being more, well, have you played Tetris? But Splatoon 1 has always interested me in a way that no other game has. It is a game that has its stages be the most experimental, whether it be for the best or for the worst. It intrigued me to say the least, but I never really had any reason to replay Splatoon 1 and try out all the stages it has to offer. That was until Nintendo decided to announce the shutdown of both the 3DS and Wii U servers, which would ultimately make Splatoon 1, the first game of the series, to be completely unplayable in terms of its multiplayer maps. So that sparked a bit of interest in me to try out all the maps and rank them to see which ones are the best and which ones are the absolute worst. I sure do wonder what the worst map in Splatoon 1 is. Not like I have any personal vendetta against one of them specifically. However, before we actually start this ranking, I do want to clarify some things. Firstly, as I'm a very casual Splatoon player, I'm only going to be talking about the Turf War versions of all of the stages. I could rank all the other variants from Rainmaker to Tower Control to Splat Zones, but generally speaking, I couldn't really tell a difference unless it's very noticeable. And besides, have you seen the stage rotation of Splatoon 1? It takes about 4 hours for a stage to rotate. 4 hours. And that's not to mention Splatoon 1's infamous... oh goddamn, stop! Secondly, I'm not an expert on stage design in Splatoon overall, so if things seem a little off from this ranking, please keep that in mind. I don't really obsessively look at the map design and see, yes, I know what makes this stage the best and the worst. And lastly, and this may be of a shocker, it's my opinion. Anyway, with all that said and done, let's get started in ranking every single Splatoon 1 stage from worst to best. Wouldn't it be fun if Kelp Dome wasn't the worst? Okay, I didn't think it was possible for me to hate a stage more than Kelp Dome, but Walleye Warehouse proved me otherwise. This stage is just awful, plain and simple. I never would have imagined just how bad Walleye Warehouse truly is, considering that before I thought it was just D tier bad, but recently playing it just filled me with rage I've never felt for any other stage other than Brightwater Springs, and that is saying something. The entire map only delves into fighting your way past the linear hallways if the enemy gets near your spawn, sometimes you get stuck in corners with no way out. It's just a miserable experience, and it doesn't help that in terms of atmosphere, having it set on a warehouse has as much appeal as being in the back of an Ace Hardware store. I should know, I've seen one before. This stage is just bad overall. I never wanted to see it again. Oh god damn it. And now we get to what could have been at the bottom. I never liked Kelp Dome as a kid, as it always just felt really annoying to play on. I couldn't put a finger as to why, that is until I played Scorch Gorge and found out that I'm not a huge fan of graded paths. Sure, it does provide some advantages with you being able to attack above or below, but it equally also suffers from it if you're the target. That's not the only reason though, as I found the whole thing to be too open and big, with you feeling rather exposed no matter which way you are. I will admit that the greenhouse setting is nice, and considering that Walleye exists, I suppose I could give Kelpdom the edge, but only slightly. I really don't want to forgive it too much. It's still not a good map in my eyes, and will forever hold a special place in my own personal hell. Much like Wall Warehouse, Port Mackerel shares many of its similar issues like tight hallways and a general sense of linearity. In comparison though, I don't really mind the stage nearly as much. Don't get me wrong, it still has its issues, but I don't know, the atmosphere is a little better compared to the warehouse. And I mean, technically it doesn't have a proper midsection, so that's neat? I don't know, it's not enough for me to deem it less frustrating than the last two, but still not worth discussing at the end of the day. It's just Port Mackerel, it certainly does exist, and it's probably going to fade away in my memory for like a good second. Out of all the stages, Camp Triggerfish is the only one I genuinely couldn't remember how I played before I made this video, to the point where I even put it at C tier based on assumptions. Now that I finally played it, I shouldn't have assumed it's mid, because it's way worse than that. Now to give some credit, I do like the camp setting, as I think it's a pretty cute premise. The idea of the teams being initially mostly apart with only one way to their territory prior to the 1 minute mark is pretty neat, and the layout isn't completely bad, I guess, but the execution of it all is what drives it down for me. It just felt really annoying to traverse through a mostly linear path with some walls being rather obnoxious. Both teams can easily get to the other's base and sneakily ambush, and though this one is a bit subjective, I feel like this stage promotes chargers a lot more since they can simply snipe down their enemies. I really do like what Camp Triggerfish has going for it, but with its current state, I'm just not that impressed. If you like Camp Triggerfish, I can reasonably understand why, but to me, I just really don't like the way it plays in Splatoon 1. I can't really say how it plays in Splatoon 2 though, so I'll leave you an update note whenever I do get around to it. Blackbelly Skate Park. Where do I begin? This stage is the most clunky of the ones I've played, and it's not for the better. To give it some credit, the layout itself and design isn't bad, and there is some good routes to take, not to mention that the skate park fits for a game like Splatoon. What makes this one not work for me, however, are the curves. I swear, traversing through these is not satisfying, and leaves a disadvantage towards weapon classes such as rollers. I should know, I play rollers. Apart from that, the general map itself is just a bit too open, with not a lot of cover to take, although that could just be me. Much like Camp Triggerfish, this stage could have been a lot better. It has everything going for it being a decent stage. Alas, this is what we're stuck with. A pretty terrible stage. At least they redeemed themselves in Splatoon 2. They actually fixed it. Huh, that's really weird. I'm willing to bet some of you are a bit surprised to see Salt Spray Rig this high, even though it's often regarded as one of the worst Splatoon stages ever. While I can't deny that, there's just something about it that makes it a unique experience, be it the really bizarre layout with the spawn being on opposite sides, and mid being on top and bottom, or the multiple routes you can take from the elevators to inkable pipes. Sure, Salt Spray Rig is truly something to at least admire, even if its execution is just as messy as everyone claims it to be, with many of its strengths also doubling as its weaknesses, on top of some matches being a bit too one-sided, like it could either be really boring or really frustrating. There's just no middle ground with this one. Still, I do have a small guilty pleasure for this mess of a stage, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And I would have asked for it to return in Splatoon 3, but this might be controversial, especially knowing how many players adore this map, but I never liked Hammerhead Bridge all that much. It's not like it's bad or anything, there's just something about it that's never caught my appeal as it has to many others. I'll at least give it this, the routes it has are decent, and though I'm not a fan of the graded pathing, it does add some verticality, which is nice, I appreciate that. Although, the fact that the whole thing feels cluttered does bother me a little bit. Not a whole lot, as my most recent match with Hammerhead Bridge does prove that it's not exactly cluttered, just It feels like there's so many places for me to go through that it kind of feels overwhelming. Not a deal breaker, just something I'd like to add. Even with all I said, I still couldn't find it in me to truly see what the big deal is about Hammerhead, and considering that my Wii U was in complete pain in the ass as of writing this script, and the fact that Nintendo's gonna shut down the servers anyway, I may never fully know. Not a bad stage, but I couldn't really say it's top tier for me. How many comments am I gonna get that I'm wrong because it's actually peak? I'm actually scared about that. Moray Towers, sweet baby, let's go! This is the stage that I have the most guilty pleasure of playing on, more so than Salt Spray. It's the only Splatoon map ever to be completely vertical, and even though I do admire the sheer ambition of it, it also ultimately leads to several problems like being exposed for taking the short route. Actually, getting to mid at all just takes forever and it's like a total drag. And I feel like this stage heavily promotes chargers, as I feel like it's a match made in heaven for both the stage and the users themselves. Despite all of that, I just can't help but love it because of it. It's in a similar vein to Salt Spray Rig, where the execution of both stages are so stupid that it makes me both amused and kinda laugh a bit. In this instance, however, I'd say Moray's leagues above Salt Spray. But regardless, Moray Towers is an incredibly flawed stage that realistically shouldn't be ranked this high, but it's too funny for me not to put it at C tier at least. And just a reminder, this is above Hammerhead Bridge. This is not helping my case at all. Here we have another map that I also have a guilty pleasure of playing on. Wow, I have 3 of them. Strange. Although I do slightly prefer it towards Moray for it not being as vertical. Sorry, Moray fans. Out of the starter stages available from launch, Arowana Mall is probably the most okay that I've played, which I guess says a lot considering that not many people even like Arowana Mall. It's not like it's an amazing stage though. Things like mid being too open for anyone to attack, and the curves being just as unsatisfying are pretty known, but there's also a few things about it that makes me enjoy it more than the average player. Things like having a decent layout and it taking place in a mall is something I do admire, but I guess none of those attributes really changes the way how I generally feel about playing through this map. Playing through the stage, however I want to fucking call it. It's the most okay feeling stage in the game to me, and it'll forever hold that title. Unless it got better or worse in Splatoon 2. I don't know, I haven't played that game in so long. Rounding out the last of the original stages, we have the original Urchin Underpass. Or I guess its second version. As this is based on the revision it got, I unfortunately can't really say much for what it used to play like at launch. From my general understanding though, it seemed like the original Urchin Underpass wasn't received too well, and I guess that prompted the devs to change it up by version 2. The result does seem to be better, but it's surprisingly mixed from fans. Where do I stand on it though? It's a pretty decent stage overall. Nothing too extraordinary, but sometimes a simple map with no major gimmicks is all you really need. It has the usual multiple routes, one of which you can take and ambush your enemies. Oh, come on. Although, if I do have to say one thing, this map does seem to have a lot of spots for anyone to hide and ambush right where the others least expect it. And yeah, it's knowing when it happens. But to be fair, this can also apply to literally any other stage in the game, so it's not an exclusive problem to Urchin Underpass. It just seems like it's more apparent there compared to everything else. Nonetheless, I still had a decent time with Urchin Underpass. A pretty good stage overall that doesn't do anything fancy, but it gets the job done. Not much to say otherwise. Also, I do like the fact that despite this being like the central stage for Splatoon, it only appeared in like one game. Its other appearances in fucking Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Hey look, a Mario Kart reference. On a more similar note, I have nearly the same feelings for Piranha Pit as well, though I kinda do slightly prefer it by a small bit. I do like the conveyor belt, as it offers some advantages when put at the right spot, and even though the layout overall is a bit too open, there's still some enjoyment that I got out of it that I don't really mind it all too much. Really, the one thing that I'm not too keen on is some of the space being just there. I know it sounds weird, but at no point would I or my team ever take the time to go to this one spot unless either we need some more ink coverage or the enemy covers about a majority of the stage. And even though the conveyor belts are helpful, they're also a bit annoying if you're fighting against it. Still, despite these gripes, I think Piranha Pit is a pretty good map that elevates itself a little bit above Urgent Underpass, though I think both stages are about as equal in terms of my overall feelings towards them, so it's not like it's drastic or anything. I'll be honest, I didn't expect myself to like Bluefin Depot as much as I did when I first came back to Splatoon last year. Much like Camp Triggerfish, Bluefin Depot is a stage I hardly seem to remember much of, with the only memory of it being that it was in a couple of Splatfests. But getting to replay it all those years later, it truly makes me appreciate it more, what with Mid being split into two and all that. While it certainly is unique, the fact that it's split also means you have to pay extra close attention, as the opposing team can easily traverse their way around and attack from behind. A unique scenario that I ultimately enjoy surprisingly. While not my favorite, I have to give credit where credit is due. Bluefin Depot is an absolute blast to play, and I'm glad to see it return to Splatoon 3, albeit differently this time. In a good way for once. Wow, surprised, you get a point Splatoon 3. You know, I didn't expect to like this one as much as I did, seeing as I thought the Splatoon 3 version of the map was pretty decent. Yet, here I am having an entire blast with Museum de Alfonsino. Christ, that is like a tongue twister. For being one of the more later stages, it still manages to hold up nearly 9 years later. The stage's layout is really good, with Mid being a lot more hectic due to the many ways you can take to get to it, thankfully not in the same way as a stage like Urgent Underpass would. And it taking place in an open art museum is pretty cool as well. I do feel like it does get slightly cluttered sometimes, but other than that, I really have no major complaints. Museum de Alfonsino is a really pleasant stage with a nice flow, and is one of my favorites in the series for me. I never want to say that name again, that actually was hell to even pronounce. Given that this is one of the final stages released for the game, Anchovy Games has a lot to do in order to send off the game on a more good note, and while initially playing it I didn't feel much, thinking back on the experience I had with it here and in Splatoon 2, I do suppose that this stage does give off a pretty good final impression, at least to me. The propeller mechanic is a really interesting idea that does allow for more variety within the gameplay, so it also does get a little annoying when it becomes inconvenient enough, such as being unable to take one path because the propeller just winded down. Otherwise said, between that and the stage's layout being fairly good, Anchovy Games unexpectedly became a favorite of mine, and while it did return in 2, I do hope it reappears soon enough, assuming there'll be another Splatoon game after 3. It is a crime for me not to play this stage enough to remember what it genuinely felt like back when it launched, because Mahi Mahi Resort is not only a unique stage with a unique gimmick, but it's also one of my absolute favorite stages in the game for me. Firstly, I love the hotel pool setting a lot. Not only does it show just how unique the hazard is with Mahi Mahi, but it also connects me a little bit, seeing as I've hardly been to hotels with pools, making those experiences a unique memory to me. Personal bias aside, the layout is also pretty cool with many different ways to get to Mid, all involving little islands for the first few seconds of the match, right before the water's levels drop and suddenly BAM! A whole lot of new turf is open. This can provide for an interesting comeback scenario, if possible anyway. However, despite the high praise I'm giving to Mahi Mahi Resort, there's only some things that does prevent it from being number 1 in my eyes. You do get exposed a lot when you're jumping from platform to platform, and as cool as it is seeing the stage expand, perhaps it's left a bit too open and big. But I don't mind those nearly as much in the grand scheme of things. Despite all these flaws, Mahi Mahi Resort still remains as one of my absolute favorites in the series, and I can completely see why its remake in Splatoon 3 was absolute garbage. It's not so bad anymore because of its remake, but I could easily classify that as the GBA Sky Garden of Splatoon. That is one of the weirdest sentences I've ever said for a Splatoon map, I guess. Whether or not this is a predictable spot for some of you out there may vary, But in my experience of playing the first game, I found myself enjoying Flounder Heights a whole lot. In fact, it may be one of my absolute favorite stages in the game, if not the entire series. There's a lot to talk about in regards to this complex battlefield, like how there's multiple ways of getting to midpoint, conventional or not, the verticality of Flutter being pretty spot on, the general atmosphere being very calming and nice to look at, and overall, it flows the best out of all the stages I've played in the original Splatoon. There have been some that I appreciate for its ambition, some for it being just plain good, but Flounder Heights elevates itself up and beyond with my praises. There's not really a complaint I can really say for Flounder Heights, as far as I know anyway. Maybe there will be a day where I'll find one flaw, but until that day comes, Flounder Heights remains as one of my absolute favorite stages in the original Splatoon, and the very best that game has to offer. And there we have it. Every single stage in Splatoon has been ranked. I didn't know what to expect going into this video, considering I haven't played the game in such a long time, but replaying all these stages years later, and knowing what would be of them in the following games is an interesting journey throughout. Sure, many of these stages aren't exactly the best, some outright suck, but I do have to give credit where credit is due. The map design and gimmicks are one of the most unique aspects that Splatoon 1 has, from water levels changing to a stage being completely vertical. These aspects would unfortunately seem to be lost with the following games, as Splatoon 2 stages are more safe and standard, at least from my viewing, and Splatoon 3 stages, well, that speaks for itself, but at least they're starting to improve a little bit. Can't really say for certain, but we'll see how long that'll last. In any regard, Splatoon 1 will forever hold a special place in my heart, not just on a personal level, but for everything else as well, including the stages. The stages themselves may be mixed overall, but it's more fun taking risks than to not try, and at the end of the day, at least Kelp Dome and Wale Warehouse are immediately thrown away. But they'll come back anyway, so let's just enjoy this while we can. But that's all I gotta say. Thank you all so much for watching. This video wasn't intended to happen, but Nintendo's announcement of the Wii U and 3DS servers shutting down did spark a bit of interest for it, and thus here we are. This is the second video about a game that's having its servers ending. If this keeps happening, this might be an overcoming issue. I want to clarify again that I'm not an expert on knowing what makes a Splatoon stage good or bad, so I'd like to hear from you guys. How would you rank the Splatoon 1 stages? Do you want to obliterate me for calling Hammerhead Bridge mid? Let me know down in the comments below, considering joining my Discord server if you can, and remember that Urgent Underpass needs to come back. I mean, Stu cares about you. Wait, that's not Stu.